In the quietest hour of the night shift, a hospital janitor spots something small gleaming on the floor. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Most would ignore it. He pauses. Something tells him to look closer. That split-second decision is about to alter the course of a patient's life dramatically. What he finds isn't just trash. It's a clue, a quiet signal that danger is near. What happens next is quiet, but it matters. And it begins with the hidden world of the night shift. The hospital corridor glows under the hum of fluorescent lights, shadows stretching across the linoleum floor. Elias moves with steady rhythm, the mop pulling water in smooth arcs and leaving a damp, shining path. His cart rattles softly beside him. Bottles of cleaner, folded rags, a roll of paper towels. The air holds the sharp sting of antiseptic, mixed with a faint trace of bleach. Nurses pass him without slowing, their soft shoes silent on the polished floor. Charts in their hands, voices low, their attention stays on what's happening behind the closed doors. To them, Elias blends into the background, part of the quiet machinery that keeps the hospital moving. Night quiet makes small things feel louder. A dropped pen echoes, a flickering bulb draws the eye. Your senses catch what the daylight rush brushes aside. Elias notices details, like a stuffed rabbit under a chair, or a chart resting on a windowsill instead of its rack. His patience tunes him into things others might not see. His care stretches beyond cleaning. He straightens chairs without thinking, makes sure hand sanitizer dispensers aren't empty, and smooths crooked stacks of magazines. He knows the scuffs on the floors, which doors catch at the hinge, and which ceiling light has always buzzed faintly. And there's something else. He carries an old brass key on his ring, the metal worn smooth from years in his pocket, a tiny weight that reminds him constantly of the responsibility he carries in these halls. Hours into the night, routine carries on. Mop forward, mop back. The squeak of the rolling cart. At times, it feels like the hospital breathes in rhythm with him. But routine has its cracks, and Elias is one of the few who notices when something slips through. As his cart rolls past room 307, a nurse steps out, her hands full with a medication tray. Her pace is quick, distracted. In her hurry, she misses it. Something faint, something shining at the edge of the doorway. Elias does not. His eyes find the reflection and his steps slow. The moment seems small, just a flicker against the floor, but it's enough to stop him. And that is where the night quietly begins to shift. A small metallic glint lay near the doorway of room 307, catching Elias's attention as he steered the cart forward. His shift was close to ending, and the quiet walk home was already forming in his mind. Still, his hand stalled on the cart handle. A flash of metal on a linoleum floor draws the eye, simple as that. At first glance, it looked like nothing. Maybe a broken clip, maybe a can tab, or the bent piece of some hospital gadget, the kind of thing that usually went straight into the dustpan. Elias almost let it go, almost told himself it could wait until morning. But habit and a sense of care that ran deeper than fatigue made him lean down instead. His knees ached as he squatted, the stiffness of long hours pressing at him. The object was cool and hard between his fingers. He lifted it. A bracelet, the kind with a white plastic strip and embossed letters that fade with wear. The print was worn thin. A name, a room number. He held it closer to the light. The tag caught against the brightness, and the small red inscription along the edge came into view. Usually, lost items got logged in the morning, A nurse or clerk would deal with them by the time day shift settled in. Elias thought about placing it in his bag and moving on, but the weight of the piece stopped him. For a moment, he just turned it between his fingers, letting the fluorescent glare slide over the words. And then he saw what sat in that faint lettering. It wasn't just somebody's tag, and it wasn't just a clue back to a room. It carried a warning. A medical alert meant to be visible on a patient's wrist, not lying unnoticed on the floor. The realization tightened in his chest. The bracelet in his hand was light, almost weightless, but what it carried could decide far heavier outcomes. He stood there in the hallway with it, knowing routine no longer covered what he was holding. Choices and consequences were starting to build, and he would have to face them. Elias stood frozen in the hallway, the bracelet resting in his palm, heavier than it should have been. He read the name again, Margaret Peterson, and the room number matched the patient inside, 307. Along the band, the small red letters spelled out a severe allergy warning, something that should never be missing from a patient's wrist. His stomach tightened at the thought. If medication went ahead without that safeguard, the result could be devastating. He thought about the system he worked in. Hospitals have roles and routines, and sometimes important things fall between them. Doctors issued orders, nurses carried them out, and staff like him stayed in the background, keeping the place moving quietly. More than once he'd seen how observations from someone in his role didn't always land. He remembered pointing out water pooling near an electrical outlet, only to be waved off and told to keep mopping. The message had been clear: stay in your lane. His thumb moved across the raised lettering on the tag. He considered simply placing the bracelet on the counter at the nurse's station, letting someone else deal with it when they found the time. The thought carried appeal. It was easier, safer. Nobody rolling their eyes, nobody thinking he was reaching too far outside his work. But then, his mind returned to Margaret Peterson. She was more than a chart in a folder, more than the soft shuffle he sometimes heard when he passed the door. She was somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother, maybe about to receive the very thing this bracelet was meant to prevent. The idea of her in distress gnawed at him with more force than the risk of being dismissed. He clenched the bracelet and started down the hall. His cleaning cart rattled softly where he left it behind, forgotten. Each step pressed heavier than the last, carrying him closer toward the nurse's station. He shaped his words silently in his head, rehearsing, bracing himself for the invisible barrier he'd have to step through. And that's the moment you recognize he isn't taking the easy path. He's choosing the harder one, carrying more weight than most people will ever notice. At the desk ahead, the phones and keyboards hummed softly. A new test was waiting for him there. The nurse's station glowed under the dim lights, a pocket of activity in the still hallway. Phones chirped softly, papers shuffled, and the muted clack of keys broke the silence. A young nurse sat with her back half-turned, shoulders rounded, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her, tired, busy, focused on the charts. Elias stepped closer, holding the bracelet where the light could catch it. His voice came quiet at first. "Excuse me. I found this near room 307. She didn't look up. Without pause, she gestured vaguely toward a box at the far end of the counter. "Just put it over there. We'll deal with it in the morning." Her words dropped between them, small but sharp. Silence followed, filled only by the steady rhythm of her typing. Elias stayed where he was. Normally, he would have let it go, melted back into his work. But the red lettering on the band pressed against his skin. He thought of past moments when he'd been brushed aside. The loose rail no one fixed, the flickering light ignored for weeks. Those had been annoyances. This was different. He cleared his throat, his voice steadier now. "I think this might be important," he said. "There's a medical alert on it." Her hands slowed. Her fingers, still hovering over the keyboard, finally stopped. The sound that had kept pace through the exchange fell away. For the first time, she glanced toward him. Her eyes flicked to the bracelet, then back to her screen. The pull of fatigue and the weight of habit seemed to hold her in place. Elias didn't lower his hand. He turned the strip so she couldn't miss the red letters. "It belongs to room 307, he added. That detail landed. The nurse froze, the tension written on her face as she processed what she'd just heard. The change registered not with words, but with posture. The quiet shift of someone realizing this was no routine interruption. He stood, arm extended, the bracelet between them like a question. He didn't move. The senior nurse, Sarah, reached across the counter and took the bracelet from Elias's hand. Her fingers, steady from years of repetition, now slowed as she turned the band toward the light. Her eyes narrowed against the glare, scanning the faded text. The tired curve in her shoulders lifted as the red warning caught her focus. Her breathing shifted. The sounds around them, the soft beeps, the hum of air vents, the shuffling papers, seemed to thin out as the moment pulled her in. She read the words again and again. When a possible allergy mismatch shows up, the standard response is to stop and verify the orders. Certain allergies can trigger fast, severe reactions if the wrong drug is given. She knew exactly what this meant. "Margaret Peterson," she said, low but firm. "Room 307. They're prepping her IV antibiotics right now." Her chair scraped sharply on the floor as she stood. For the first time that night, her eyes met Elias's, clear and direct. He wasn't background anymore, not to her. She reached for the phone in one fluid motion. First call, the medication room. Her tone was clipped, urgent, each word meant to stop the prep immediately. Next, the charge nurse. Clear instructions, no wasted phrasing. The emergency chain began to move, each link catching as trained, but sparked by a single object that should never have touched the floor. Down the hall, a technician held a vial ready. They were seconds away from mixing the drug. For most patients, it was routine, safe, unremarkable. But not here. Not with Margaret Peterson's name on the chart. What might have been a quiet, ordinary dose now looked like a door to crisis. Two nurses pushed quickly past Elias, their calm movements holding a sharpened edge of purpose. He stayed by the counter, watching the bracelet now resting between them. When Sarah glanced back, her expression had changed. A slight nod, and then, as the room steadied again, she murmured one word he hadn't expected to hear. "Thanks." The medication was stopped. The danger dissolved before it began. Still, the air carried the weight of what had almost happened, and how close it had come. Something larger was just starting to unfold. The antibiotic was never given. The fourth bag stayed filled with plain saline. Margaret Peterson slept through the night, unaware of just how close the danger had been. Her chart was flagged with clear red warnings, and a fresh bracelet was clipped back onto her wrist. In the hallway, the team shifted into quiet motion. Orders were checked again against the updated chart. The pharmacy system echoed the new alert. Each person who touched the case carried with them the thin moment when it almost broke. Elias returned to his cart, pushing it slowly down the corridor. The mop swished against the floor in its familiar rhythm, but the sound carried a different weight. Nurses who once passed him without pause now met his eyes with a brief nod. One even murmured a quick, "good catch," as she went past with another tray. Small gestures, but enough to mark that something had changed. Near misses tend to linger in memory and change how teams watch for the next one. Once you've seen how easily a mistake can slip through, you keep scanning the edges more carefully. Awareness spreads from one pair of eyes to many, and the net grows finer. From her place at the station, Sarah watched Elias work. She saw the way his gaze swept the corners, how nothing escaped his notice. He moved steadily, not with urgency, but with attentiveness. That difference mattered. Where the clinical staff focused on tasks, he carried a wider view. It was a kind of vigilance that didn't come from textbooks, but from presence. As the night wore down, a new respect filled the unit. The old lines of hierarchy, so firm at the start of the shift, seemed less rigid now. Safety looked less like a rule and more like a responsibility that reached across every role. Elias finished the last stretch of hallway, the floor catching the lights above in clean reflection. For him, it was enough that Margaret would wake safely in room 307. Somewhere, a family kept sleeping. That quiet fact matters. By morning, those currents would begin to surface in new ways. Threads drawing the caregivers closer together. The morning handover meeting carried a different tone. Sarah, the night nurse, stood before the day shift team and recounted what happened with the bracelet. She spoke of Elias noticing it, of how she nearly dismissed him, and how close the unit came to a medication error. The usual rustle of papers stopped. Pens were set down. For a few minutes, the room listened in silence. Think of hospital safety like a web. Every thread matters. The dietary aide who sees a patient struggle to swallow and alerts the speech therapist. The transport orderly who notices a patient's breathing change during a transfer. Small observations like these form an invisible net, holding patients safe. Later that week, those threads began to show. A physical therapy assistant spoke up about a loose IV pole. A housekeeper pointed out a patch of wet floor before anyone slipped. Simple calls that earned quick action. Each one traced back, in spirit, to Elias's choice to step forward that night. The shift in culture was subtle but strong. Medical staff began pausing when a voice rose from outside the usual ranks. They paused. They listened. They checked. The cleaners, the aides, the clerks, each began to feel like more than background. They were an extension of the watchful team. What took shape was a new understanding. Care doesn't belong to one role. The doctor's diagnosis matters. So does the pharmacist's review. The nurse's assessment matters. So does the aide's quiet observation. When teams treat each other as part of the same job, small problems get caught earlier. No formal announcement marked the shift, but the hierarchy softened, and what filled the space was recognition. Recognition that watching closely, speaking up, and respecting each perspective makes the hospital safer. That morning meeting wasn't just a handover of charts and tasks. It was the passing of a message. Attention matters, wherever it comes from. And once heard, it doesn't fade, which leads to a truth that often hides in plain sight. Sometimes the smallest actions carry the greatest weight. In every hospital, safety doesn't always come from the big moments of medicine. It often arrives through the smallest actions, noticed in the corner of someone's eye and brought forward at the right time. This balance between complex systems and human attention creates the difference between harm and healing. Think about the airline mechanic who sees a faint line in the metal of an engine and calls it out. Planes keep flying not just because of engineering, but because somebody paid attention when it mattered. That is the same truth Elias lived that night. A flash on the floor, a tag in his hand, a quiet choice to bring it forward. People who pay close attention tend to catch what others miss. Maybe it's a loose strap, an empty dispenser, an unusual sound in the hall. Each observation builds another layer of safety into fragile routines. Elias's story isn't rare. In hospitals every day, someone outside the white coat notices what others don't. A cleaner sees a patient's breathing change and signals the nurse. A maintenance worker spots damp wiring before it sparks. A cafeteria aide notices a visiting stranger lingering where they shouldn't. Small observations that never show up in headlines, because the emergency never happens. Heroism wears many uniforms. A mop, a cart, a volunteer vest. Each can matter just as much as a doctor's hands. Every role becomes part of the same net that holds patients when care alone isn't enough. The real power doesn't lie in dramatic rescues. It lies in the gap before crisis, where someone chooses to see and act instead of looking away. Tiny decisions, born from human care, carry a weight no system can replace. What happens next is quiet, but it matters. And in that quiet space, you start to see where real heroism lives. Sometimes in the people whose names you'll never know, yet whose moments leave lives unchanged in the best possible way. And that brings us back to Elias, because his action carries a lesson that lingers far beyond his shift. A reminder of what it truly means to safeguard another life. Elias's story reminds us that heroism doesn't always wear a white coat. Sometimes it carries a mop, pushes a cart, or works quietly through the night. Remember, they may be holding someone's fate. These acts of quiet vigilance happen around us every day, often without notice. Say in the comments who surprised you most in this story. Elias, the nurse, or the pharmacist? Share your answer and take a moment to recognize the unseen hands that keep lives steady. Enjoy the story. If you believe in these healing stories, subscribe for more.